what did you guys think of the sort of the methodology that Aquinas used in the Summa?
Actually, a quick question about that. Are the questions they asked initially, like, are those questions he's been asked personally, or are those just questions he's been thinking about?
I think those are questions that he's been thinking about. He's posing the questions based, though, on what people are asking and want to know, but I don't think they're specifically from anybody in particular. It's not a dialogue at that level. He's posing questions that he knows need to be answered and have been raised before. Yeah. Anybody want to comment on the method that he uses, which I'm sure you've never encountered before, probably, I'm thinking? Yeah?
He seems to always get the last word. Once he says something, he doesn't like build on that, which we see in the dialogues. But he has the article question, what usually said, his response, and then refuting the argument, the actual argument, what it says, but then he doesn't build anything on that. He just says, this is how it is.
This is done. This part's done. On to the next part. Yes, it does give you that feeling of this is a very exacting method. Probably does feel a little bit more closed, but you're comparing it to the Platonic dialogues where you have this sort of spiraling out of various different points and the discussion continues. In his defense a little bit, if we had all of the the articles under the question, I think what you'd see is there's some building there, but it's not the same kind, really, you're right, as the dialogues. It's a sort of logical building. The first article is supposed to be about the most basic and general point that he can make about the question, and then as the articles proceed, he narrows, he takes on more specifics. So there's a little bit of building in that regard, but it's not the same. And it does have more of a closed or cut and dried kind of feeling, which I think he wants. He thinks that this scholastic method, is what this is called, is sort of a scientific method in a way for handling moral and ethical and religious questions. At the time, this was kind of it's the best method. And so he wants to impress you with the logic of it and how everything is kind of sewed up. Okay. Max, did you want to add to that?
I don't know if I just wound up completely missing some of his dissertations, but it seemed like when he was restating his statements at the end of some of the sections, he had changed his mind on some ideas in the first set of statements. That seems kind of unusual for something that he prepared, so I kind of assumed I was wrong, but I couldn't really think of anything else at the time. So
yeah, it can give you that impression, and this is why I wanted to stop and really focus on the method, because when you first read this, you're not quite sure what part to focus in on as actually the essence of what Aquinas thinks as opposed to what maybe other people have argued and so on. And so really kind of keeping in mind the method helps to get to the heart of what he's arguing. So what you get in the first typically 3 sections of any of these articles are objections to his argument. So as if to say, well, some people say this, and some people say that, and some people say this, but then I say, okay, and that I say is the on the contrary, and then I resolve, or whatever it is, his wordings, a response. And then the last 3 items are going back up and addressing each of the first objections, right? Specifically to make sure that it's clear why those objections are incorrect. And so he is, if you look at the objections, and let's say you get rid of the middle, you look at the objections at the top, and you look at the answers on the bottom, you get a sort of dialogue going there between those who disagree and agree with Aquinas' position. So you've actually got a couple of voices in these articles, one that's the opponent and one that's Aquinas. And what bothers people is this method puts the objections first. You know, we're used to getting well, I want to argue this, and, you know, here's my thesis statement, more or less, right? And then here's what other people say and here's why they're wrong. But in this method, what you get is, here's what other people say, here's what I say, and now here's why they're wrong. So it's not the way we're used to addressing problems, and it can lead to a feeling that he's contradicting himself. Yeah.
Was this like common in other literature at the time, or was this sort of his thing?
It was something that he mastered and was the model of, but it was more common than that in theology. So he was following a method that was respected and was followed by others.
Okay, so this is more of like a theological methodology than like a political one, and he sort of just imparted that upon.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, I think that's fair to say, yeah. And it was tied up with this idea that we should be as logical as possible. We want to be clear. It has a sort of legal feel to it. It's also very imbued with authority. And I hope you noticed. I mean, Aquinas is very impressed by authority, right? The authority of the philosopher, which is Aristotle, and the authority of the Bible, and then other theological thinkers too, like he mentions Augustine and Ambrose in there, and so he frequently cites these sources, and these sources, unlike the way we think about sources today, the authority of these sources in Aquinas' mind adds automatic weight and credibility to his argument. Okay, in other words, especially if you can cite the Bible and do it well, if you're not cherry picking, which he seems to be sort of sometimes accusing his opponents of doing, then you've got some real weight to your argument there just by having that. And same would go for being able to cite especially Aristotle, because he had become to be recognized as a weighty authority and a philosopher of the first order, and so therefore finding a way to show that Aristotle said this or agreed with your point of view would automatically add weight and seriousness. Now, do we think of sources the same way today? When we see, like, we read somebody's paper or article and they cite 15 sources, how do you take that? It's better than not citing sources, but...
It depends on the quality of the sources. in some
Okay.
cases.
Yeah.
If they're citing like Breitbart or say a ridiculously partisan newspaper or something, it's probably not going to be, well, their arguments can be as well structured.
Okay, yeah, so one thing you look for is bias,
Yeah.
and whether the news or the information has any credibility, or if it's just a sort of propagandistic.
I was
Yeah.
gonna say, like, discounting academic work, I mean, I can't even remember in the last like 3 or 4 years that like you have just like an excess of professional sources. Like it just traditionally feels like it's in a very, like 15, 16 sources is great, but I feel like a lot of times it's just, oh, here's another piece of information that kind of goes in, or here's a statistic, or here's this, like,
Yeah.
and I know I do it too. Like, I just need this one quote from this one guy, let's drop it in the paper, and then like, that's my source or whatever for that. But I feel like most specifically recently, it's the good old days before all the news was fake. But like genuinely
about
running
that.
into this problem in which like I feel like people just sort of drop anything and everything and call it a source, whether or not it actually is. So like 15, 20 sources might be great, but I generally get skeptical when I start seeing like a lot of sources, because it's like, why do you need that many? I guess.
So you actually have the opposite reaction as maybe a reader of Aquinas' time to his sources, partly because there's so many of them. I think that's a big difference between then and now, that there's so very many possibilities and so much doubt about credibility at this point, right? That in order to trust those sources, even in an academic writing, you have to look into the quality of them all, what they're really is this author just citing them for the sake of citing them, which often happens in order to kind of add a veneer of credibility, or are they doing it in a really meaningful way? If you check those sources, would they actually say what the author is, saying they say? Things like that, right? So we have this, and I think this is one of the effects of Secularity 3, or the developments leading up to it. We have this skepticism, this sort of built-in skepticism, right? Where the sources don't, there's so many of them, we don't even expect to recognize them in an academic article. Like, who is that? I may or may not know. And so despite the fact that we struggle to be credible on the basis of building our arguments on sources, other people, professionals even, are going to read that and they're not going to automatically say, oh, well, that's true then, right? Or that's really worth listening to. Yeah.
You mentioned Taylor on page 117. The ultimate end of human action is happy or blessed life. I saw just fullness. Taylor would say that definition would be fullness. So linking to.
Right. Yeah, I mean, you see this this earlier way of thinking here mixed with just the beginning of a more modern way of thinking, but we're a long ways off yet. And so, the reliance upon authority is just something that would not work today. If I wrote a paper and all that I cited was, let's say that I mainly cite, Hans Morgenthau when I'm writing a paper on international relations, because Morgenthau is like this big, kahuna from the 20th century who kind of became one of the fathers of international relations realism. No one, at least in my field, maybe out, if I wrote it in a blog, it might still get some action, but nobody would respect that at all, Be like, well, that's old, and that's been superseded, and blah, 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 right? So old doesn't make it better now. One source isn't, automatically the be-all and end-all source, right? We don't, in IR, there's no Bible, in other words, right? But here we have this interesting, notion that to be able to cite and cite well the Bible as well as the philosopher and a few other sources will really do it. And it did, right? I guess is the point I'm trying to make. I mean, this was very credible and was taken very seriously and continues to be, actually. Aquinas' work is huge in the development of political thought, moral thought, of course, Catholic theology, and more Christian theology generally. But it does represent an earlier way of thinking. And so you might read it and go, well, that's not enough, that doesn't quite convince me, because we're used to not being convinced, right? It's harder to convince people like us. I think So what we have with the questions is the largest level or the biggest level. Like you've got the question at the beginning there on the essence of law, or you've got a question about theft and robbery on page 130, and then the articles are the steps along the way to dealing with that larger issue, how it is to be thought of by, in this case, Christian citizens, right? And the articles go from, as I said, the more general to the more particular as he nears the end of dealing with each question. So what I wanted to do now is turn to question 66, which is in the second part of the Summa Theologica, on theft and robbery. We touched on this issue in the class beforehand, but I want to kind of get into how he argues this out, okay, and what we're to glean from this. So he starts out with, in Article 1, with this question whether it is natural for human beings to possess external things. Okay, first of all, let's just ask, why is that an important question for him and his readers to ask? Whether it's natural for human beings to possess external things. External compared to what, first of all?
Internal.
Right, right? And why is internal important here?
Because like that's, I guess, from what everything it sounds like, you have, self-ownership of your body, so that you sort of have this, I guess, sovereignty over your own choices, and your decisions are your own regardless of if they're correct or not. They're yours. But if you don't own, a piece of property, you might not have the ability to make decisions for it, which sounds like weird to say, but
Yeah,
I guess that's sort of the
that's you kind of got the thrust of the argument there, yeah. So there's these internal things which are not about property, and they're particularly important for him and his readers because the internal is also the seat of the soul. So what is internal is something that ultimately is more important in the minds of these folks than the external too, right? And so the question is it natural for human beings to possess external things? The assumption is we possess internal things by being human beings. And this is, and the sanctity of some of them becomes kind of clear as time goes on. I think that's right. What might have been, can you kind of glean from the objections what another position would have been, like maybe from an earlier era or even from Aquinas' own time on this issue? Whether human beings, whether they naturally possess external things, as in ownership?
Number one seems to be pretty distinctly just sort of saying that, like, the whole old school, like, render under Caesar what is Caesar's, render under God what is God's, except God is everything. Like, he owns it all, period. So, like, for you to sort of try to take a ownership role of something that's God's is, I guess, disrespectful and not your place. So that's sort of what seems to be a bit of an issue.
Yeah, that's the issue. That's the issue is if God is the owner of everything, if God created the entire world and everything in it, then that would seem to suggest that he owns everything, and that it would be wrong to say the human beings do and can control it for their own individual benefit, okay? So that implies that there are groups or people have come up from time to time within the Christian traditions, starting, I know, all the way back to the beginning, where they decided that Christian people ought not to own property, okay? You have to kind of read between the lines here, but that's there. He wouldn't be asking the question if there weren't some people who are basically making that argument and then concluding, therefore we shouldn't own property, we should share everything. Yeah.
I guess, like, if creation is what defines ownership, are they, like, inherently accepting that, like, we as humans are owned by God, or is that not even breached?
I think that these objectors might very well make that statement, that everything, including human beings, are owned by God, and therefore what you do with your own body and internal state are not your decision to make. So I'm sure there were people that went that far, and many other people who didn't quite go that far, but simply said, I think the more typical position would be, we're going to share all of our things in common, right? Because supposedly the apostles did, the very earliest Christians kind of did. That was the ideal, that they shared with each other and they gave away everything. And so there's quite a bit of, biblical support for something like communism. Interestingly, they wouldn't put it that way, but think back to the distinction or the division between Plato and Aristotle on this topic, okay? And how Plato idealizes communism. Very much a pre-Christian thinker, but his notion was you can't really own private property, or even think of your own body and your family as your private, ownership, because if you do, you will disregard or, not pay enough attention to the needs of the community. So we'll take away the property, and, we'll have these guardians and these leaders think only about the common good, and their pain will be your pain. And then we have Aristotle come along and say, nope, that doesn't work. What we get is the tragedy of the commons. People won't take care of their property. It's not practical. Goodness does not require, moral goodness does not require that people give away everything and have no property. Okay? So we see that argument continuing here in the Christian context between those Christians, earlier Christians, and maybe some at Aquinas' time, I'm not sure, but I know earlier Christians who thought that it basically, Christianity demanded poverty, meaning complete, giving away everything and sharing everything, and others following Aristotle, or at least Aristotle's rationale, that it just doesn't work, and that charity is required, right? That ownership is good as long as you also recognize that you have a duty to your fellow man and you give what you can. Okay, so that's going on in the background, and that's one of the great things to pick up in these objections is, what are people saying or have said? It reveals a dispute within, in this case, theology, as to what's appropriate. Okay, so we see that he says that those who want to exclude married and property owners from the hope of salvation are heretics. Okay, heretics is a scary term, and sometimes it really is scary, but not necessarily I'm not sure that Aquinas wanted to personally go out and find, round up some people and build a bonfire, but heretics definitely means they're not really Christian. They aren't following the correct Christian, teaching, and therefore they can be condemned or condemnable. So he's definitely saying that they're very wrong. They've got it wrong. But then what we see after that, and by the way, that's on page 131, about 2/3 of the way down, after he has acknowledged that monks and clerics in the Catholic Church may live this way, and so people may have the idea that this is the ideal way for all people to live. He then goes on to respond with 3 things. Now, if you look at the response, do you notice anything that's missing there? I'm trying to get people to look for what's not. In that paragraph that starts off with, human beings have a double competence. What would you expect to see in his own statement about what's right, what's the right position here?
Something that has its origins in God.
Yeah, you might expect that. Here's the master theologian, right, who is very competent in the Bible and cites it elsewhere. There's no citations here. In fact, there's no citation. He doesn't cite the philosopher either, like he does in some other sections, which I'm not sure how to explain. Maybe it could be that the arguments here are so obviously Aristotelian that he doesn't think he needs to mention it. Okay? But the 3 arguments that he puts forth are very practical. They derive from Aristotle very directly, and he does not tie them up with a biblical citation. Okay? They're about what works, and so what's missing there, I'm not trying to make a point really of a specific point, except for that you should always ask yourself, especially for a medieval thinker, because they rely so much on authority, when they don't cite the Bible, you should notice that. Because it could very well be that he can't derive this thought very neatly and tidily from the Bible, and that's why he doesn't. Right? That's a possibility, because if he could, he would. And that may mean that he believes that it needs to be supplemented by logic, which I think he does, that there's a place for that within Christian theology, for supplementing or for elaborating or modifying. Let's look at the three arguments that he gives. He says, first, because each person takes more trouble to care for something that is his sole responsibility than what is held in common or by many. That's one of Aristotle's responses to Platonic communism. Second, because human affairs are more efficiently organized if each person has a separate responsibility to discharge. That also is derived from Aristotle's discussion of the division of labor and the efficiency of it. Okay. And third, because humans live together in greater peace where everyone is content with his own responsibility. Okay, we notice that quarrels often break out amongst those who hold things in common without distinction. You remember how Aristotle makes the point that you'll be a better citizen if you have property? Because you have a stake in the larger society, you take a direct interest in it, and you're going to want to compromise with your fellow citizens if you're in a position to do so. So this is Aristotle that he's more or less paraphrasing here. And then look at the next paragraph, where he does cite a biblical source, Paul in Timothy 6:17 and 18. He says, the other competence of human beings is to use and manage the world's resources. Now, in regard to this, no one is entitled to manage things merely for himself. He must do so in the interests of all, so that he is ready to share with them and the others in case of necessity. And this is why Paul writes to Timothy, as for the rich of this world, tell them to be generous and willing to share. Okay? So what is added there in that paragraph that we didn't get in the previous one? He adds the citation, but what's the citation add? What does the argument that the citation reflects add to the argument above that isn't in there?
Morality.
There you go. Christian morality in this case. But yeah, morality, the idea of that, yes, above are the practical considerations. This is what works. But if we stop there, we justify, or could justify, selfishness, right? We could justify really we could go all the way to Adam Smith with what he writes above, But with the second paragraph and with the source that he cites, he adds in this notion of, but you shouldn't do whatever you want to with your own property. So the ought, that's morality, right? And in particular, the injunction to be charitable. Right? So Aquinas' answer to the concerns above is that no, the correct Christian position isn't communism. That's not necessary. You can do that if you're a monk and you want to, right? There's no law against it. But for ordinary people, it's not communism, but charity, okay? We can stay within the system of private property, but we also have to care for our fellow man, and this is the way that we do it, okay? Now, later on down the road in the development